Welcome, everybody. Welcome to what is part of our Leonardo da Vinci Symposium, but is also the inaugural Mercedes T. Bass Lecture. It's about Leonardo and the world. The good news is I'm not going to give you a full lecture. We've invited 5 of the great speakers that are part of this Leonardo Symposium. So I'm going to give a little talk, but then we're going to also have you all involved, and we're going to have 5 speakers from our symposium. We're also going to end the afternoon or evening with Jeff Berkus, who designed this room and this building, and he did so, as did Herbert Bayer, who designed the other buildings on this campus, with Vitruvian Man specifically in mind. So he's going to explain that to you. But first, I want to say a few words about Mercedes Bass, who has endowed this lecture. Mercedes isn't with us, as some of you know. She's not feeling well, but I think she's watching it on live stream. So I want to say to Mercedes, thank you. And also, as I think about Mercedes Bass and Leonardo da Vinci, I realize that one thing they share is an interest in everything, from art to music to science to learning and other people. And I think that's been the theme so far of this event, which is you lead a much richer life and you're far more likely to be creative if you love everything there is to learn about the world, including how we fit into it. Another thing that Mercedes did for me, I'm going to ask Luke to say something when it's his turn on the panel, but she introduced me to Luke Sison as well. So Mercedes, be assured that Luke, I think, is having a great time here, and we thank you. So let's thank Mercedes Bass. We've talked about the word genius a lot, and I just threw it around the way we often do. Earlier today, I mentioned to Martin Kemp that words that we slap onto things, whether they're acronyms or commonly used words, sometimes keep us from seeing things rather than reveal things to us. It's something I learned from Walker Percy, who said, the minute you label something, you quit observing it quite as closely. And so I do think that in the spirit of Leonardo, we ought to be careful about any labels we put on. One problem with the word genius is that it makes it sound like it was a superhuman trait, as if somebody is touched by an ability that's beyond our mortal ken. Leonardo's very first biographer, I think, made this mistake. He said, he didn't mean it intentionally, but Vasari said that sometimes a person is endowed with such superhuman traits that every work from his hand is divine rather than a work of human art. One thing we've learned about Leonardo in the past couple of days is that it wasn't some just divine thing. It was divine, but it was also by human hand, human will, human effort. He was a very human person, and his successes came because he willed himself to be observant, willed himself to be curious, and willed himself to do the type of things that you or I could do. Not that we could paint the Mona Lisa, but we can at least try to observe every time we see a smile flicker across somebody's face. We can try to think about the inner emotions. Every time we see people making gestures at a supper, we can say, what are they reacting to? What are the gestures all about? And one of the signs that Leonardo was human, that we've talked about quite a bit in the past 2 days, is that he left a trail of unfinished projects. The very beginning, the question was asked, what would you ask about Leonardo? And I think we've all wrestled with the unfinished projects that he left. Among them was a horse model that was reduced to rubble by archers, the Adoration of the Magi, tanks that never rolled, flying machines that never flew, a battle mural that was abandoned, and brilliant treatises that went unpublished. One of the things in his notebooks, I think it was every time he had a new pen he had to figure out how to use, he'd say, tell me if anything is ever done. Tell me if I ever did a thing. Of course, he did things. In fact, the things he did, the things he finished, were enough to prove his genius. The Mona Lisa alone does that. And by the end of the day today, as I was thinking it through and hearing all the thoughts about it, I began to appreciate even more the genius of the things he left unfinished, the genius of the things unexecuted, the mystery surrounding some of what he did, the finger that he didn't finish that was pointing but left a little bit hazy, the flying machines and military projects that were fantasies, but as he says in his own treatise on painting or his notebooks, that ability to see things that not only can be seen but things that are unseen, that ability to have an imagination and fantasy, that too made him a genius. And by refusing to churn out works that he had not perfected, he sealed his reputation as being one of the great ingenious artists of all time, rather than a master craftsman. I think that he enjoyed the challenge of conception more than the task of completion. We've heard the different reasons. I'm going to add one that I've been wrestling with about why some things were left uncompleted. I think it's partly because he had an uncanny ability to feel motion and to convey the idea of movement. One of the most sophisticated things in his notebook that involves math, and I wish he had been more mathematically theoretical, he would have invented calculus, because he comes close with this, which is that a point is infinitely small, has no space. Same is true of a line, and same is true of an instant of motion. It contains what happened before, what happened afterwards. And with all due respect to the quantum theorists in this room, there are no discrete particles of either motion or points or time, and yet we do have a flux of motion that does exist in our world, and that's what intrigued him, whether it was a body moving, or water moving, or rivers. No instant, he said, is self-contained. No action in a theatrical pageant, nor a drop of water in a flowing river is self-contained. Each moment incorporates what comes before and what becomes after. And I think he looked at his art and engineering as something that was moving, not something that could be declared static. He carried around with him the Mona Lisa and so many other works. Even St. Jerome, he paints it, and I think he probably, from what we know, gets the neck muscles wrong, but 20, 30 years later, he does his anatomy studies, he goes back to it and gets the neck muscles slightly different. He changes them slightly, gets the two of them crossing so that he gets it right. All of this, to me, is what adds up to make him a genius, but a very human genius. It sets him apart from people who are just extraordinarily smart. Those of us who live in Aspen know a lot of people who are very, very smart. They're kind of a dime a dozen, and we know that sometimes they don't amount to much. It's that imagination, that creativity, and that's what sets them apart. Schopenhauer once said, talent hits a target that no one else can hit, but genius hits a target that no one else can see. And as I said at the very beginning, part of Leonardo's human genius was its universal nature. There were thinkers who were far more profound, far more theoretical, some who were even wiser and more practical, but none who was as creative in so many different fields. Some people are geniuses in a particular arena, Mozart in music, Euler in math, but Leonardo's brilliance hit multiple disciplines. As we're about to hear, as you go into the Renaissance has produced a lot of Renaissance men. It produced a lot of polymaths, but none of them did it while painting the Mona Lisa. None of them did it while producing unsurpassed anatomy drawings built on multiple dissections with a visual display of information. None of them did it while coming up with schemes to divert rivers, explaining the reflection of light from the earth to the moon, opening the still beating heart of a butchered pig to show how heart valves work, designing musical instruments like the one right outside of that door there, choreographing pageants. Leonardo was a genius, but he was more. He was the epitome of the universal mind, one who sought to understand all of creation, but most importantly, how we fit into it. And so with that, I would like to bring the people who taught me all the things I knew about Leonardo and still have a lot more to teach me. Bill Cook, Martin Kemp, Ross King, Luke Sison, and Bill Wallace. And we're going to ask each one of them. Thank you.
I have a serious... Oh, okay.
You must be plugged in.
I must be plugged in.
This is a rule in the Door Hosier Center.
I have a confession to make. I'm here by fraudulent means because by trade I'm a medieval historian. And for many people who talk about or read about the Renaissance, the Middle Ages is that thing we finally got through. It was 1,000 years of barbarism. It was the Dark Ages. And so very often we assume that the switch from what we call medieval to Renaissance periods is a switch from darkness to light, from barbarianism to an extraordinary kind of sophistication and intellectual genius. And as my chemistry professor once said when I gave the wrong answer, it just ain't so. And this ain't so either. And what I want to do is just briefly illustrate a few things that are part of the medieval heritage that whether consciously or unconsciously, Leonardo has absorbed, thought about, and taken forward far beyond his medieval predecessors. We know that one of the things that Leonardo is so extraordinary with is his careful observation. We know that from all of his drawings, from his paintings, from everything we know about him. Well, I want to point out that he's not the first careful observer of nature. And let me suggest a couple reasons why that is true. First of all, the writings of Aristotle were translated and used in Western Europe beginning at the end of the 12th century, long time before Leonardo. And when I teach my students about Aristotle, I say, let me sum up Aristotle in one sentence. He believed the following: all knowledge begins with sense perception. If you believe that, and Thomas Aquinas did, there are consequences that follow from that. If all knowledge begins with sense perception, you better use your senses well, and they better be accurate. Because as one theologian said, if you make a mistake about the world, then you will make a mistake about God. So for reasons perhaps somewhat different than Leonardo, observation was very important. Secondly, a fella came along at the beginning of the 13th century named Francis of Assisi. And his most famous biographer, St. Bonaventure, wrote this: for Francis, nature was a series of footsteps leading to God. If you believe that, there are consequences. You want to follow those footsteps carefully. You want to observe nature carefully. So it's important for us to realize that these ideas are already hundreds of years old and deeply woven into the fabric, not necessarily unchallenged, but woven deeply into the fabric of medieval society. Now let me give you another example. I want to look at one painting of Leonardo very quickly by looking at three predecessors. The one you see now is a painting by Simone Martini, who lived about 175 years before Leonardo. It is an Annunciation, painted in Siena for the Cathedral of Siena. And you'll see, although it's very different than Leonardo's, it's a very beautiful painting. And you'll see the elegance of the pose of the Virgin Mary. And you'll notice that she is sitting with a book in her hand, although it says nothing about that in Luke's gospel. It is an extraordinarily beautiful painting. We want to be sure we don't make the mistake that necessarily the more realistic painting is by definition the most beautiful. Let's look at the next one. I guess I have to do that myself. This is an Annunciation by Fra Angelico, a painter from the middle of the 15th century. He died about the time Leonardo was born. And you can see there is perspective in the architecture. There is perspective in the background on the left side. You can see back there, in fact, Adam and Eve being expelled. And you see this beautiful Virgin Mary there in prayer with, again, her book to receive the announcement from the angel that she's going to be the mother of Jesus. And let's look at the next one. Botticelli, he's a pretty good painter. Botticelli just a few years older than Leonardo. But look at this lyrical figure of the Virgin Mary. Look at the angel, look at the light, look at the gossamer outfit that she's wearing, sort of fluttering. But look also at the background. Look at that beautiful view through the window into nature. So in a sense, Leonardo didn't start from zero. Plus, not only is the Annunciation an important event for Christians because it's exactly 9 months before Christmas, but also in Florence at this time, it was the New Year. It was the time when the New Year began and the calendar changed. And so this was a civic and a religious event so commonly depicted in Florence. Let's look now at Leonardo's. Well, we have the Virgin Mary in the same colors, you'll notice, in front of a Renaissance palace. But all the other paintings also showed contemporary settings rather than historical settings. We have the angel. We have a beautiful background. And so for me, as somebody that comes from the older stuff, the question I always ask is, okay, old story, faithfully told and retold, what's new? What's exciting? What's extraordinary? Well, look at the wings of the angel. They may not be as colorful as Fra Angelico's or as big as Botticelli's, but by golly, those that fly. And that's an important thing to say. And look at the landscape. Yes, Botticelli's landscape is extraordinary, but look at this almost mystical landscape we have as we fade into the light behind. And Mary as Renaissance woman sitting at a reading desk, been there, done that. But not this Virgin Mary at this reading desk, but in front of that palace with that angel, with those wings, with that background. Mm-hmm. This is a wonderful story, old and retold so many times. It seems to me, with Leonardo, it's new.
Bill Cook, that was, since he got into it before I could even give his name. But it's always great to start with a great medievalist. But in some ways, it brings up pictures that had been done before, and one of them we haven't talked about enough is Salvator Mundi. And both Luke Sison has been very involved with it, and he and I have discussed it, and Martin is about to come out with a book on proving its autograph status. Luke, why don't you help us put this into context?
So let me give you a little bit of background. We were just looking at one of Leonardo's earliest, if not the earliest, painting he executed in Florence. This was painted perhaps in Florence, perhaps I've suggested right at the end of his first Milanese period. But that said, it's come onto the scene incredibly recently. We've always known that Leonardo painted a picture of this subject. There are lots and lots of copies of it, and it's documented in a print from the mid-17th century by Wenceslas Holler. But until about 2 years before the National Gallery exhibition in 2011, the original was thought to have been lost, if it was ever even painted. And so when I remember, I had the incredible privilege of flying to New York, where it was then, and examining this picture in the conservation studio at the Met. I think just 2 or 3 scholars had seen it up till that point. And part of the reason for that was to try and decide whether we would be going out on a sort of serious limb to show it in London with works which were universally agreed to be by Leonardo. If you want to do something that sort of attracts almost immediate opprobrium, try attributing a painting to Leonardo da Vinci.
And they're done that, right?
So I wanted to talk about a little bit about why, in the end, there was a pretty immediate consensus that this was indeed the lost work. It was examined at the National Gallery by a range of scholars, including Martin here, and that was an important ingredient. Attribution does, to some degree at least, depend on consensus. But what are the ingredients then of a successful attribution to Leonardo? I was struck this morning when Jeff Koons was talking about collapsing the hierarchies between the high and the low, that in a sense Leonardo is the artist who most bridges, who most straddles that gap. We all know him as perhaps the greatest, the most famous artist who ever lived, and yet his images are also imprinted on our memories and our imagination in a way that almost the authorship doesn't matter. It's ceased to be the key issue. And I think that was something that actually arises precisely from Leonardo's own desires about what painting should be. He believed in rules for painting that were in their own way as absolute as the rules he was seeking in nature. Some of those rules he was finding in nature itself, but others he truly believed in were to do with divine inspiration, were to do with perceiving. His famous quote about the stains and blots on a wall and how those can take shape into an image is a very important concept for this picture. So what we're looking at here is a painting of Christ as the Saviour of the world. I'm glad this session is called Leonardo and the World, because Salvator Mundi is exactly that. And it had been in a collection in England from 1900 to 1954, where it was attributed to a copyist after Boltraffio, one of Leonardo's pupils. It was severely overpainted at that point and made its way to America, where it was then rediscovered in something slightly more glamorous than a garage sale, but not much. A brilliant rediscovery, cleaned and restored subsequently by Diane Modestini, and we were able to follow the process of that restoration. Because of the copies, of course, it was important to the scientific examination was incredibly important. We had to establish that the way it was made was consistent with the ways in which we know Leonardo executed his pictures. So, for example, there are tiny spolveri, the dots from the transfer of a cartoon, in the head. The rest of the body, as I remember, is much more freehand. And that's a classic combination for Leonardo of a carefully prepared face or head and then something much more improvised around. And actually, even that process of planning and improvisation says something about this question of the balancing act between the visionary, if you like, and the observed in his work. And I think that what we see here is a work that in which Leonardo has done all the things that we've now come to expect in order to arrive at an image which has that essential quality, that absolute quality, that when it comes, and I hope it one day will be into a public collection, will, I think, imprint itself on the memories of all of us in the same way. And I want to just talk most quickly through three of those things, and then I know Walter has a question. Let's look at the hand, the blessing hand first. That is a piece in which the observation of anatomy, of the fall of light, of volume, of rilievo, as the soul of painting, as Leonardo called it, is all extraordinarily present. Despite the slight abrasion that this picture has had, and it's not in great shape, I can talk about that in a minute if you like, the hand is one of the best preserved parts, and it has a quality when you see it in the flesh of projecting out of the frame and into our space.
Is that because he draws it much more sharply and the visual acuity makes it seem it's closer? I
think it's partly that. It's simply it's much more defined. And I think in lots of, when this picture first appeared, I, among others, felt that the reason for the difference between the hand and the head, which people found very troubling, some people found troubling when it was shown at the National Gallery, newspaper critics rather than Leonardo experts, I have to say, sorry to be damning, was that sort of, essentially that kind of spectral, numinous quality in the head of Christ. Can we just go forward one slide? I'm just showing you this because I think the reference for Leonardo was this image here. The frontality of the head of Christ is so unusual in Leonardo's work as to demand some kind of explanation. And what you're looking at here is one of the three possible candidates for the so-called Mendelian of Edessa. So this is one of these images that was miraculously imprinted, the features of Christ, on a piece of cloth. He sent, in fact, to cure somebody when he himself, it's like a sort of long-distance cure. And by the beginning of the by the beginning of the 16th century. One of those examples was in Paris. So, you know, remember Milan has just been invaded by the French, and another was in Genoa, which was a Lombard possession. So there were lots of reasons why this might be a good candidate. And I think what you're seeing is Leonardo, just as Bill just said, looking at a tradition of image making, of miraculous image making, where he himself is giving us a sense of what that almost miraculous appearance of Christ might look like. And then there's, of course, the ball.
Let me, before we go to the ball and before we go to the things, let me bring Martin into this, because Martin was somebody who is writing a book with some people on how you show that this was an autographed Leonardo. First of all, is this the first painting of Leonardo to be, by consensus, put into authenticated in how long?
In over a century. The last one was the Madonna Benoit in Hermitage in St. Petersburg.
Right.
So they come along very seldom. Photograph Leonardo. It's not like buses, they don't come along together twice.
Yes, right.
Yeah, could I just pick up on what Luke said about the difference of the sharpness of the hand and the blur of the head? This is at a time, we know roughly when this picture was painted, when Leonardo is looking again at the human eye, and rather than thinking it's a simple instrument, as he did initially as a young man, finds it's incredibly complicated. And he doesn't have a concept of a focusing lens. So he says at one point in a manuscript D, which is titled Dell'occhio, on the eye, he says, the eye does not know the edge of any body with absolute certainty, but he knows there's a median range. If we're too close, and he discusses this, we can't see. If we get to the right point, it depends.
Everybody can do it.
It's
Look at your hand there.
It's further out for me now than it used to be. And then as it gets away, it gets less certain. So you can read this as a kind of optical statement. It's the exaggeration of what actually
And he had three forms of visual perspective, he did, right?
Yeah,
the
yeah.
typical one that shows lines converging, and then...
But what I would say on from that is that if that's an optical statement, it actually serves a spiritual function.
Absolutely.
Because you've got the head rendered ineffable. You cannot really know the true features of Christ. So you can know the hand. So there's a in a way, the optics and the spirituality, and this is part of Leonardo's extraordinary one, he's able to get the science and the spirituality working together in an extraordinary way.
Now, with the science and spirituality working together, this is one of my favorite paintings, so I'm going to drill down on it. There's something unbelievably puzzling, which is he knows optics, and he's got this solid crystal orb that represents the world. Even the inclusions, those tiny little dots, are done with scientific precision. And yet, there's something that's not quite the way you would normally expect it, which is a crystal globe like that would distort and invert what's behind it. If you take a glass of water and you look through it, it's upside down. The robes of Christ would be changed, but they're not. And I'm going to ask both Luke and Martin, to me there are three explanations. One is he wasn't really studying optics, he had no idea what he was talking about, and he just got it wrong.
Well, that's clearly not right.
So eliminate that.
That's clearly right.
Yeah. Secondly, he thought, well, I'll let you all do it.
Well, so I think what we have to just remind ourselves is what this object is. It's meant to be a perfect sphere, one of the great Platonic solids made of solid rock crystal, the most pure form of quartz that was known. And at a moment when, I'm told, craftsmen didn't actually know how to form quartz into that perfect sphere. So it is in itself a miraculous object. And of course what it represents is the orb of Christ as King of Heaven. In the various copies that were made, some of them sort of chickened out of the rock crystal and put in a much more conventional orb. Now, I think there are actually, I think you'll I'm not sure that the degree of distortion that you're looking for would indeed be present if you're pressing the flesh against the
No,
the
his
surface
palm of his hand
the
is
palm of his
done
hand is
correctly.
against-
It's the robes that are.
It's the robes that are essentially wrong. Well, I mean, I mean, Martin can talk about this more, but I mean, he certainly talks about crystal and glass in both in scientific, but also in sort of metaphysical and metaphorical terms, as the things that let light through without altering it. And so he's thinking here, I think, about that sort of purity of vision, and it's there because it's a symbolic object. And were you to be disturbed by a sort of weird distortion of the robes of Christ, then that balancing act, that careful balancing act that I've been talking about between the symbolic and the observed would be disturbed, and the picture would be pushed off too much, I think, in one direction.
Yeah, in one word, why he doesn't do anything much with the refraction behind is decorum, the Latin word which means good manners.
Exactly.
And it wouldn't be pictorial good manners to have some extraordinary optical effect taking over the whole picture. Leonardo wouldn't, for instance, though he know about refraction, wouldn't show Christ and John the Baptist's legs bending in the water.
Yeah.
And
In the baptism of Christ, you mean in the river Jordan?
In any baptism.
Yeah.
But Leonardo says and acknowledges there are certain visual effects which are for the speculatori, for the speculators. Blur, he knew about blur, but he wouldn't paint blur. Velasquez did in Las Meninas, but that's extraordinary. That he knew about blur, he knew about optical effects, which were not pictorial good manners, and he's making, after all, functioning pictures for the client and the devotional images.
Mm-hmm. And they need to, as Bill implied, they need to some degree, to be familiar iconographically. One of the things I was struck by when this picture first appeared, and it's been much written about, and I think I didn't make this exactly clear earlier on, it's been said quite regularly that the face of Christ is very badly abraded by overcleaning probably in the early 17th century, when it belonged to the English royal family, or perhaps even earlier when it was in French possession. We do know that the background was completely repainted green according to a French fashion, and the background that you see now the black background that you see now is actually the work of Diane Modestini. But almost everything else, apart from a single crack that runs through the panel, is actually it is abraded, but it's in better shape than one would think. And so what that's bringing me to is the kind of weirdness, if I can put it like that, of his beard. And what you're seeing there is, again, a deliberate contrast between those classic Leonardo light-filled curls and a sort of what's now known, I believe, as a scruff around his chin. It's actually, again, part of a pictorial tradition. You see this quite regularly, that the beard of Christ is not described with too much detail. The painter isn't a barber, so he's not having to shave Christ, and as a result, you're not having to think about it in that sort of detail. And as soon as you're distracted, your devotional eye is distracted by too much realism at that point, then the picture's devotional function will collapse.
So that connects to the orb as well.
Yeah.
Let me go back to the topic, which is Leonardo and his world. And I'm going to ask Ross King, who wrote the great book, The Last Supper, and many other things. What was it about Florence at that time that allowed such creativity?
Well, in the first place, what you needed was a patron. You could not do a painting like this on spec. I think it's not known who the patron of this was, or
it's surmised that it might have been the French monarch, but
Louis XII at one point said, "I have need of Maestro."
Yeah, exactly.
Leonardo de Vinci, as he called him,
But Florence was filled at that point with rising middle class and rich merchants building palazzos who needed to show their good taste.
Exactly, and there were people to requite that good taste. Leonardo was, as I'm sure everyone who's been with us for the past couple of days knows, he was born in 1652, and he is
1450, yeah.
1452. 1452.
He's getting younger.
Inspires confidence.
Born in 1452, he's first recorded in Florence in 1472 when he was 20 years old, but clearly he was there for at least a few years before that, probably by 1466. I've been writing about Claude Monet, so 1800s keep coming back to me. And so by 1472, he'd been there for a couple of years. But we know for a fact that in 1472, there were 44 goldsmith workshops in Florence, which was a city of around 50,000 people, probably a maximum in the 1470s of 50,000 people, which is and I don't want to pick on anyone who might be from here, but that's the population of Pocatello, Idaho. And so you have there 44 master workshops of master goldsmiths and silversmiths, into one of whose, Andrea del Verrocchio, Leonardo went. There were also more than 30 master painters. So if you were going to be a young apprentice as a painter, you would go into one of these workshops. And so in this relatively small city, you had a huge number of workshops of artists who were requiting, as Walter says, the need among this group of wool merchants and bankers in Florence for works of art, for altarpieces, for example, for family chapels, that they were endowing in the various churches that were being constructed at that time. And also, really from the middle of the 15th century on, there was a great building boom, a palazzo building boom in Florence, as people began building very large city homes for themselves, and also places in the country. And so there was a kind of critical mass of wealth, because of course someone needed to pay for the Renaissance. It was no use being a genius if there was no one who was going to pay you to do your genius work. And so if Leonardo da Vinci did not have patrons, his first patrons were people like the city fathers of Florence, the politicians in Florence, who in 1478, when he was 26 years old, commissioned him to paint an altarpiece for a chapel in the town hall, a very prestigious commission, which sadly he didn't complete, or all of the monastic institutions in and around Florence. And so you needed to have people who were willing to buy your work. And the other thing I would say about that, I mean, if you think about 44 workshops of goldsmiths in Florence, some of them, they're not all going to be great, obviously, but there's a handful of really, really good ones. And there is inevitably going to be competition between and among them. And the Florentines really exploited, the Florentine patrons, whether it was the wardens of the cathedral or whether it was the city fathers, managed to exploit this kind of competition whereby they would pit artists against one another. They did that for centuries. They did that around 1300 when they first began constructing the cathedral. And they did it famously in 1406 when they had 4 blocks of marbles for the evangelists that they were going to put on the facade of the cathedral, which had been started just over a century before. And they took 3 young sculptors, one of whom was Donatello, of whom I'm sure many of you have heard. And they gave each of them a block of marble. And they said, whoever does the best evangelist gets block number 4 and can work on that.
But it seems that it was more than just artists, that there was a mix in Florence where you have more wood carvers and you have butchers.
That's right.
But you also have mathematicians. You also have people, painters inventing perspective. You have architects and artists working hand in glove. You even have people inventing double entry bookkeeping. And so there's sort of a mix of talents that all sort of crammed together at that one time.
And also the other thing that you didn't mention in that really impressive list is the classical scholars, because Florence by the middle of really by the first decades of the 1400s, becomes the center of classical studies.
And the year Leonardo is born is around when Constantinople falls.
That's right.
So you have a whole influx of what?
Of Greek manuscripts, which had already been going on before that. In the 1420s, a Sicilian named Giovanni Orispa flooded Florence with hundreds of Greek manuscripts, many of which were on mathematics. So Constantinople was a big moment, but it only increased, aggravated something that was going on already.
But also in 1452, the year he's born, is when Gutenberg opens his first commercial print shop.
Walter, could I just say something in favour of Milan as well? Because it's true that Florence is an incredibly important cradle.
Sponsored here by the Friends of Florence. At some point, somebody may
important.
start the Friends of Milan,
All right.
and you'll be invited back. But we'll give you a minute
All right,
anyway.
thank you very much. Now, I just wanted to make the point that that the incredible creativity of the Florentine, as it were, system, if you like, of creativity, was then harnessed by the greatest of all of his patrons, really, Ludovico il Moro in Milan, who was looking for a Florentine, looking for somebody who'd been precisely trained in that mode, somebody whose work would stand out against the kind of sort of glamorous nose style of Lombard art at that time. And what I think is important is that it released him from this world of contracts and deadlines and so on and so forth. And Martin Vancker, the German art historian, wrote a piece about the court artist in which he argued that the concept of modern art, or the modern artist as we understand it, begins at the court, because that's the place where they're given the freedom to essentially explore, they're given the time to experiment, they're given the space to think really hard about what they want their art to be, and that's the point. They're there to be. They're there to develop their skill.
One major difference between Florence and Milan at the time is Milan had a court.
Exactly.
And Florence is
a republic.
technically a republic with behind the scenes the Medici running things, but they don't sort of have a castle in which they're putting on, mathematical discussions each evening.
I would add one thing, and that is, today, if we look at the Middle Ages or modern America, we tend to look back to those great heroes of the past and say, well, we can never catch up to them. There's not going to be another Abraham Lincoln, or there's not going to be another Plato, or whoever it is. The Florentines, who are more and more educated about the classic, said, Aristotle's good, Plato's good, we can do better. Not we can try to come close. In the Middle Ages, the sort of motto was, we are dwarfs on the shoulders of giants. I think we could say in Florence, although I don't know anybody who ever articulated this, we are bigger giants on the shoulders of giants. And that's a very big difference.
If I could put a plug in for Brunelleschi, I think he was the one who allowed them
He's
to
from
believe
Florence,
that they were
okay.
moving out from, literally they had been living in the shadow for over 1,000 years of all of the ancient Roman monuments, which had been built by pagans after all, and suddenly with Brunelleschi, who built something that was 18 inches in span, wider than the greatest Roman building, the Pantheon, suddenly gave a kind of boost of self-confidence to the Florentines. And there was the great poem
Was there something special? You have Brunelleschi and then Alberti, who comes right after.
Michelangelo.
Yeah, but well,
I have to speak up at some point.
I'm actually talking about engineers and architects. if
He's
you
the
like.
best engineer of the Renaissance.
He wasn't bad.
So somebody who tries to be engineers and architects as well as artists and build things like the dome of the Duomo, or write, as Alberti did, a treatise on architecture. Is that something new in which art and architecture and engineering are coming together?
I would say not necessarily, and Bill, I'm hoping you're nodding vigorously, Bill, because I think that the whole idea of the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, I think you cannot deny how spectacular the cathedrals of northern France are that were done in the 1200s. And so obviously engineering and art came together in an extremely meaningful way, but all of their names are lost to us. One of the earliest of these geniuses, one of the first person named as a genius, is in Pisa, Buscetto Guidici, whose name is on the front of the Duomo in Pisa. And it says the Snow White Temple was built by the genius Buscetto Guidici. And that's really one of the moments where a builder gets credit for something that is incredibly magnificent. So I think what we've all been trying to emphasize, maybe some of us like Bill more emphatically than others, is that Leonardo da Vinci doesn't mark a break. He marks there is continuity with the past, and so he is very much a product of the environment that he's come out of, an environment that he was very blessed to be a part of.
Martin, and then I'll get to Bill Wallace.
Yeah, one crucial difference is from the Middle Ages is that those things which are incredibly high-level crafts began to acquire a theory.
Yeah.
That it began to be fashionable to have a theory. And this applied to the visual arts. It applied to something like dancing. The dancing masters begin to publish treatises with the geometry of steps. So during the course of the 15th century and particularly 16th century, if you wished your profession to be taken seriously, you needed a theory.
And did that mean you had to have a confluence with mathematics?
Mathematics was the obvious way of doing that, and the perspective for painters was great because it says we have a theory, we have a rational basis. Music had long had that rational basis,
Right.
Pythagorean and the whole mathematics of music. So perspective was incredibly good, but yeah, a whole lot of practical gunnery begins to be thought about in actual terms of how trajectories work and so on. So.
And in the Paragon, when Leonardo's trying to elevate the status of artists, he does connect it to other things like mathematics and says that it has a theory.
Absolutely, and he can see that music is a serious rival in this case because music has a theory, but he says music passes away. It's born and dies. So
because the eye is better.
Leonardo's arguments against the other arts are largely fraudulent, but but it's a court sport. You know, it's a bit like bringing us up here and generating artificial arguments.
And I get to be Ludovico. Bill Wallace, talk about both. We were talking about Florence and its magic, but what would have happened if he'd been born in another time?
Well, I love this question because there's no right answer. So no matter what I say, it's going to be fine. But every time I fly, I kind of think, wow, if only Leonardo was on this plane, he'd be like a little boy. He'd be so excited. Or if you give him plastic, my God, what he would do with plastic. But if he was born in another time, I mean, Ross has already given him 200 years ahead in the future. So he's already been born 200 years ahead. But I think about somebody like Darwin or Newton or Galileo. I mean, these are brilliant people. They're thinking 100 years ahead or so. But if you think about Leonardo, we've pretty much established he's thinking 400 years ahead. He's thinking 400 years ahead, so I don't think he's going to be very far out of his time. And we've already established, well, even in our discussion here, this is an artist who's going to flourish in a court culture, and he flourished in Milan especially. He was given that freedom. So given the court of somebody like Rudolph II of Prague, my God, Leonardo would have gone wild in a place like that. Or somebody like James I of Scotland when he took over England. This is, he would have probably found a place and flourished like marvelously. On the other hand, he wasn't a great linguist, so he would have had problems with languages in those various places. He never learned Latin. He kept 9,000 words of Latin and tried to memorize them, but kept lists of Latin words, tried to memorize them. So in some ways, he's going to be a fish out of water in lots of different places other than his own native Italy. But in a sense, he's never going to fit other places, but in Italy, they profoundly believe, and this goes back to antiquity, that creativity never dies, that it passes from one person to another. So there's a reason why Galileo chose to be buried directly opposite Michelangelo in Santa Croce, because Galileo believed that he was born on the day that Michelangelo died, and that his creativity was inherited from Michelangelo. So in fact, Leonardo's creativity, his genius, I think, passes on. It goes to Bach, it goes to Shakespeare, it's to Elon Musk, it goes to Christo.
So, yeah.
And two words that I would say that we haven't maybe mentioned enough quite in this 2 days is scale and ambition. And these are things that Leonardo thought of a lot and that are part of the mix of creativity that I think we should add in that are part of genius.
Martin, Bill just said that even Elon Musk is now inheriting what Leonardo. What is our inheritance? What do we inherit from Leonardo?
Can I begin with a slightly funny answer, but how many seats are in this hall?
412.
Yeah. This is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
Here's a painter from 500 years ago who did lots of inventions, and you're all here. So you're, in a sense, all providing an answer that Leonardo must mean something to you, you wouldn't have turned up. And not the same thing. People get lots of different things out of Leonardo, whether you're a medic, an engineer, whether you're an art lover or whatever. So, but to answer the question in the way in which you really intended it, I can tell it by the story of the number of times I get written to by American high school children asking me about Leonardo. And about 2 years ago, there was a national project, and one of the questions they asked was about technology. What has Leonardo invented that we now use? What has Leonardo done for us? I started my answers slightly rudely by saying, this is not the right question, because it's presupposing that we're in some sort of ideal state to which the past is working, which is a complete fallacy. And I said it's very self-centered to ask a question, what has he done for us in that literal way? But if you look at his range of creations and how they speak to us today, how they've spoken to us in the past, is extraordinary. And the way I would set up Leonardo and the kind of judgments we make is not by saying, is he a James Watt making the steam engine? Is he Edison inventing all the things that Edison visits? I think we should look at him as someone like Shakespeare or Dante or one of the great cultural figures, and say this is the most extraordinary monument to human vision, to human visual understanding of the world, the remaking of that understanding of the world, and about our position in it. And if you want to take a lesson from a figure in the past, and I don't much like doing this, but let's do it, what Leonardo says to us today in our particular circumstance is that we are part of the world. We're an organic part of the world. We're the microcosm. We're the little world. That's the big world. We are not masters of the world. We are an integral part of it. And I think it's incredibly important to realize that. With this age of technology, we can too easily say, we are the masters of the world, we can solve all the problems. But that manifestly is not true as we see what's happening around us. So if you're wanting this sort of slightly corny thing, but you're wanting a lesson from Leonardo, let's remember we are absolutely integral parts of nature. And if we separate ourselves out from it and say that we're superior, we're in trouble.
And there was a transition, I'm going to make this sort of a final one to all of you, that created what's called Renaissance humanism, which some of the phrases of it Martin echoed, which was this notion of how we fit into the world being somewhat different than we had thought. And I'm going to start with you, Bill, because you're the continuity expert, but I'm going to ask you the counterintuitive question, what was different as opposed to what was just the same?
A great question, and there's a lot different. If you ask what were people reading, educated people at universities in the 13th and the 16th century, the answer is sort of the same thing. The question is, how are they reading those things? And that becomes essential because, generally speaking, coming out of the tradition of St. Jerome and St. Augustine in early Christian times, the idea is we need the classics. Let's remember, every single work of the classics that survived because some Christian monk copied it 1,500 years ago. We don't want to forget that. We don't have Aristotle's own handwriting. We have monastic copies. So clearly these works were valuable to Christians, but in what we would think of as somewhat limited way. For Cicero, it's great. He teaches us how to read Latin well and how to speak elegantly, and that's a skill that's important. We don't so much necessarily take his ideas as we take the skills he can teach us. With somebody like Aristotle, the question is, how can he help inform our Christianity? How can we understand the Bible? How can we use our reason better? Because Aristotle was a good reasoner. So generally speaking, the classics in the Middle Ages had as their primary purpose preparing people for the afterlife. They were things that got you closer to God and kept you on your way as a pilgrim. In the Renaissance, that continues, and for long after the Renaissance, I might add. But in the meantime, in the Renaissance, as there are new discoveries of the classics, and as people are rethinking the classics and their relationship to the ancient world, people are saying, you know, not only is Cicero valuable for that, he teaches us how a republic works. He teaches us how to have good friendships. He teaches us things that are valuable in this life, not just preparation for the next life. And that movement that takes place that ultimately creates a kind of different secular ethic than religious ethic, perhaps is no better reflected than that in the contemporary of Leonardo, somewhat younger contemporary, a fellow named Machiavelli.
Who becomes a good friend of Leonardo's for a short while at least. Let me ask the panel to expand on this, which is, did Leonardo know that he was living at a sort of amazing time? Did he know that humanism was somewhat different? Luke?
Well, I want to answer this question somewhat simply and as you'd expect, very much from an art point of view. Up till this moment, most works of art had had some function or another. They were made for a defined purpose. Leonardo is perhaps the beginning, and obviously artists, patrons wanted those works to be done as well as they possibly could be by great people we would now judge as great artists. But Leonardo, I think, is the beginning of, in a sense, art for art's sake. It's the beginning of a moment when these works are liberated from the normal process of...
So he was doing the Mona Lisa, not just for utility's sake.
I mean, it's not even clear that the Mona Lisa was actually commissioned by Mr. Mona Lisa. It was, but it's a piece. It's about creating an extraordinary work of art that was, as we know.
And is that true of his science as well, Martin, that at a certain point it wasn't for the utility, it was for the science and curiosity's sake?
He wants to know how the world works. He wants to dissect the world and remake it. So, yes, absolutely. It is an amazing thing to be able to understand the world largely in terms of mathematics. That's the ultimate way of understanding it. As Galileo said, the book of
If he had
nature.
had mathematics, would he have been much different? I mean, that is the one thing he can't do equations, let's say.
Well, no, let's look at Leonardo as a mathematician. He is a genius at geometry.
Correct.
And he can do it in 3D in his head. He's just extraordinary.
Transformation of shape.
He's got some rudimentary algebra, but algebra which is coming in from algebra, it's coming in from Arabia via Seville and so on. Piero della Francesca had some algebra. But algebra is at a very embryonic stage, so we don't see that. He wasn't particularly good at arithmetic. He did lots of adding up and he made mistakes. But
and he had Pacioli try to teach him roots, but because that would have helped him.
yeah, no, he could do roots all right. Yeah.
I would say your original question about was he aware of the time that he was living? And it's impossible to say because he never articulates that. But other people did, other people with whom presumably he rubbed shoulders. In the 1860s, right around the time that he came to Florence, someone wrote a poem.
We're going to get back you to the 1400s, if you don't mind.
What did I say?
I don't know why you keep
It's
doing
like in the
this.
19th century.
No, I fucking talk about Claude
You could
Monet
come
for
back
the
in
past
200
year.
years if you want, yes.
Monet believed he was living in a new time. In the 1460s, when he arrived in Florence, a poem was written saying that there is a new Phidias among us, i.e. a new great sculptor, a new Apelles, a new great painter, and the ancient Greeks would marvel at what was going on in Florence, which had resuscitated the arts that had been lost for centuries. And in 1492, Marsilio Ficino, the great philosopher, wrote a letter to Paul of Middelburg, a humanist in Germany, describing how the previous century had been so remarkable, and he lists everything that had happened, all of the advances made in things, including the playing on the lira da braccio music, which we often don't think of perhaps as something that the Renaissance imparted to us. And he closes it by saying, and all of this happened in Florence. And so there was this tremendous idea that the Florentines in the 15th century were creating something unique. And I think Leonardo da Vinci, being celebrated by the 1480s as such a genius, would have been aware of the fact that he was living this time and was very much a part of it.
Bill Wallace?
Absolutely. No, I think he was quite aware. Surrounded by so many other people that were accomplishing so many great things.
You've got this generation of what I've called the super artists who separate themselves out from the regular run. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. And they were interested in fame. They knew about the writings of Pliny. They knew Pliny talked about Zeuxis and Praxiteles and so on, and they were interested in fame. Leonardo would be fantastically delighted by what we're doing now. Whether we get it right or wrong, he is being famous. And the only artist who preceded, well, Brunelleschi preceded that. He's called a divino ingegno on his tomb, a divine genius, as it were. But this new generation, they're very competitive, and they're competitive with the great masters of antiquity, not just with their contemporaries.
And they understand that the roles of what we now call arts and sciences and everything else all melded together in a way that was creating something new.
One of the poets in Milan said, "Come to this new Parnassus."
Right.
The mountain where all the divine creators assembled.
But I don't think they would have understood your question. No. I don't think they would have made that distinction. They would not have had the vocabulary to say the arts and sciences have come together. That distinction is ours. It's the one that we've made. And I think the brilliance of what was able to happen at that time is because they were what today universities madly seeking it called interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, or universality, which is what does it. I want to invite Jeff up. I know there are probably questions, but I think I'm going to do something more informal, which is I want Jeff to give his presentation, and then those who want to stay and ask questions, just come join us, and we'll do a more informal discussion up here, if you don't mind. But let us thank the panel. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a wonderful opportunity to be talking with a whole bunch of academics who understand a heck of a lot more about the Vitruvian Man and Leonardo than I do. But I will say from day one, when Walter challenged me to design a building that would fulfill the mission of the Aspen Institute, which is to find common ground, the first thing we looked at was the Vitruvian Man, as man's width equals his height. The square is a circle. The circle is about meeting in the round. And every room in this building has a geometry. So Leonardo might have not been a great mathematician, but he was absolutely amazing with geometry. So it is human nature, nature and man, and then man in nature with purpose to find this common ground. So understanding patterns and patterns of movement and patterns of flow, when I looked at Leonardo's work, one of the most compelling things to me was actually the clothing on the people and the drapery. And it wasn't so much what was seen, it was unseen and what was felt. And that is what this building was designed around. It is to bring people together, to feel, to find that common ground, to move energy around, to see what is beyond what is seen and to feel into this unseen. So the building, when you come into it, is a perfect cube or a sphere, and you are looking in perfect alignment at the Vitruvian Man window, which is the square here, the unfolded square in the corner, which connects us directly to nature, the square on the center axis of this room, and behind the screen, the square which invites nature's energy of Castle Creek and the feminine energy of the river. Leonardo understood flow coming from water and was very preoccupied by it. So we are on the oxbow of the Roaring Fork. This is the only building that's at that intersection, so this building benefits from that. Herbert Bayer, who designed this campus, worked with flow, was a total Renaissance man like Da Vinci, and drew everything. And when he worked with layers, he worked in watercolors. And when I looked into his work, it's what was unseen versus what was seen as well. And Herbert very definitely had an intention to bring people closer to nature. It is when we find our nature and can do the most for ourselves and others. There's a painting in the Murdoch room which is a perfect square with a golden section on top, as is Caddo room with a golden section upstairs, which connects us to nature. But that painting is called Moonbridge. Moonbridge was a painting I had the privilege of growing up with in our house with my father, who was obsessed with Leonardo. So Moonbridge has an arc in it, which is the arc of this bridge. And in the evening, when you cross this bridge, you see Herbert's work and the Moon Bridge, which is concentric circles within a square. So Beyer was looking at the same things that Da Vinci was looking at. And when we put this building together, we put all these perfect geometries together in an imperfect way, because this is the reality of the way that the world works. It's the flow that connects these spaces. When you are moving, you are the most activated. It's when you're using your perception. It's when you have the greatest ability to connect. The windows outside here facing north are that way for a reason. Your eyes are dilated. You can connect to yourself and each other. This building was designed to bring nature deeply within and without, and for us to connect within it. And for that, I thank the Institute and the patrons who we've addressed, because this wouldn't have happened without patrons, to allow us to pull together these perfect geometries of Da Vinci, of Beyer. And I'm going to end with Andy Goldsworthy. So Goldsworthy was our artist at the time, because to me, art and architecture are the same thing. So Andy made a wall of common ground. That wall is all sandstone that is colored by iron, which is the blood which binds us all. Andy, in a brilliant way, made a line out of a wall which is precisely 5'6" tall, which is precisely what the Vitruvian Man is, because that's the average height of man. And Andy wanted you to be able to come down and touch the common ground that came from 5 continents in this world. So that not only is this building designed to find common ground, it has common ground. It is art and architecture. Thank you.
The Andy Goldsworthy, thank you. Thanks, pal. When you look at Andy Goldsworthy's wall, I want you to look at something symbolic we've done, because it flows right into the floor. And look right on the floor there, that's the wall itself. Andy lived here while he was building it, so it could be done just at the same side of the floor. And that was to show that the flow of art, the flow of nature, and what we do in this room are all one and part of something universal. I want to thank William and Bill and William, and Luke and Ross and Martin, and of course, Jeff Burkus. And thank you all for being here. I know you had some questions. Come on up. We'll talk some more. Thank you. Interesting to me, even though I made it a disjointed moderating I am. Yeah.